George Lucas has often said that his original idea for the project that evolved into Star Wars was to remake the Flash Gordon movie serials from the 1930s, as a serial is a movie shown in weekly installments of about 10 to 20 minutes each. The license wasn't available, so Lucas moved on to other ideas, beginning with Akira Kurosawa's films, The Hidden Fortress, and then Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. Despite the plot changes, the Star Wars films are still bursting with influences from the Flash Gordon movie serials, including the Rebels versus the Imperial Forces, Cloud City, the soft swipes between scenes, the underwater city with a Monterey shape sub, and even the famous roll up, which begins the movie, the opening crawl title sequence. The Flash Gordon movie serials closely followed Alex Raymond's Flash Gordon newspaper comic strip. Raymond's strip was first launched in 1934 at the height of the Great Depression. Many of Americans were living under conditions of extreme poverty and despair, so they welcomed any kind of escape. And what better escape than into the dream of a better tomorrow? Flash Gordon borrowed images and ideas from the world's first science fiction comic strip, Buck Rogers, launched in 1929. They both featured very similar spaceships, laser pistols, costume styles, gadgets, hairstyles, creatures, etc. Raymond's strip probably captured the public's imagination more strongly because it had better art, better storytelling, and was the first to reach the theaters. But most of the Flash Gordon science fiction vocabulary came from Buck Rogers. Universal Studios made a good profit from which Flash Gordon was created from. So when the series ended, they wanted to follow immediately with another science fiction serial. The obvious solution was to make a serial based on Buck Rogers, and the obvious actor to play him was the same actor who had been playing in so many popular roles as Flash Gordon, Larry Buster Crabbe. This repeated cross borrowing blurred the two characters together so much they particularly became the same character. Buck Rogers first appeared in a novella called Armageddon, 2419 AD, by Philip Francis Nolan, from in the August 1928 issue of Amazing Stories magazine. It was John Flint Dill, president of the National Newspaper Service Syndicate, who had the inspiration to make the first science fiction comic strip. He hired Nolan to write scripts based on his Buck Rogers novel, and artist Richard Calkins to illustrate them. The spaceships, and most gadgets in the Buck Rogers strip were strongly influenced by the paintings of Frank Paul, house illustrator for Amazing Stories magazines from 1926 through 1929. Paul's vision was most responsible for creating the public perception of what a spaceship would look like from 1926 to 1966, a brightly colored cross between a rocket and a submarine. In 1946, the world was offered the first widely accepted alternative spaceship design, the flying saucer, but Paul's image remained dominant until Star Trek's Enterprise shook up the rules in 1966. Alex Raymond, Francis Nolan, Frank Paul, and George Lucas were all influenced by the John Carter Warlords of Mars series by Edgar Rice Burroughs, who would go on to write Tarzan. Burroughs' first novel was A Princess of Mars, 1912, which was really the first swashbuckling, wish fulfillment science fiction novel. The hero is magically transported to Mars, which is filled with beautiful, forever youthful women who wear elaborate jewelry with no clothes. Men are valued solely on their combat abilities, and the reader's alter ego, being from the higher gravity world of the Earth, is many times stronger than the Martians. This series routinely falls out of the public's memory because the literati don't care for science fiction, and the science fiction community takes great pains to distance ourselves from such juvenile fantasies and futile hopes of convincing the literati to take us seriously. It's a shame this book isn't better known, because if you can look past the silliness, which is no worse than any James Bond movie, Princess is most exciting, imaginative, and well-crafted adventure stories of all time. In the same league as Star Wars, the heroine Deja Thoris is a strong female role model, even by today's standards, let alone the 1912. She doesn't fight much, but she faces danger and makes sacrifices, and despite the silly James Bond-like male fantasy environment he lives in, hero John Carter is a faithful husband and caring father. Like many early science fiction adventure writers, Burroughs borrowed ideas from H. G. Wells, Western Age writer Haggard, and the other usual sources, but he seems to have also broken convention by importing into fiction ideas from 19th century physics, in the particular Helena Blavatsky, born in 1831, died 1891, and Edgar Cayce, born 1877, died 1945. Part of Burroughs' genius was in his ability to guess that like the like that ideas like telepathy, astral projection, four-armed giants, and magical flying platforms would be just as appealing in adventurous fiction as they were in visions of lost Atlantis and lost Lemuria. Portions of L. Ron Hubbard's Scientology are repeatedly based on these same authors, and the American New Age movement, including the idea of auras, the Akashic record, and the emphasis on the Devanagari symbol of for Aum, traces its roots largely to Blavatsky's massive 1,565-page book, The Secret Doctrine, The Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy, 1888. Imagine how powerful Blavatsky's imagination must have been to have influenced all these things. The subtle lesson Star Wars borrows from Flash Gordon is the idea of a fairy tale in which technology plays the traditional role of magic. This idea ultimately came from H. G. Wells. He arguably invented the genre we now call science fiction in the first novel, The Time Machine, 1895. Wells believed that culture required myth to move forward, and myth requires a shred of plausibility to work properly. Take, for example, modern America's dominant myth that we are visited by extraterrestrials. Wells believed the Industrial Revolution had quietly destroyed the idea that fairy magic might be real, thus draining the power from the fairy tales. He used the industrial era to create a new kind of magic. Time machines instead of magic carpets, Martians as dragons, and scientists as wizards. Wells based his new kind of myth partially on the work of other writers, including Jules Verne, Edgar Allan Poe, and especially Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who probably updated the Jewish golem myth into her proto-science fiction novel Frankenstein in 1888. He combined these ideas with the political cartoons he had he had loved as a child from the humor magazine Punch, exaggerating some of the aspects of the real world to circumvent his readers' preconception and make political points. Wells called his new genre scientific fantasia.